Money doesn't change people, it unmasks them. I've said that for decades, and I've seen it proven true time and time again in the harshest spotlights imaginable. When you add a substantial inheritance into a family dynamic that is already fractured by years of unspoken resentment and sibling rivalry, you aren't just looking at a legal dispute. You're looking at a psychological autopsy of a family's soul. That's exactly what I saw when I first looked into the eyes of a man named Julian. He sat across from me in my dressing room before we went out on that stage, and I could see the weight of a secret pressing down on him like a physical burden. He wasn't there because he wanted to be. He was there because his family was tearing itself apart, and he was the one holding the match that had started the fire. This wasn't just about a bank account or a piece of real estate. This was about the stories we tell ourselves to justify our own greed and the way we use the memory of the dead to punish the living. I've dealt with thousands of guests, but there was something about the way Julian held himself rigid, defensive, almost tragically composed that told me we were about to peel back layers of a story that had been rotting in the dark for a long time. Julian was a middle-aged man who had lived his entire life in the shadow of his father, a self-made titan of industry who had been as demanding as he was successful. When the old man died, everyone expected a standard distribution of assets, but instead, they got a war. Julian was the good son, the one who stayed behind to manage the family business while his sisters, Sarah and Megan, moved away to pursue their own lives. In the eyes of the sisters, Julian had been the favorite, the one who had the old man's ear. In Julian's eyes, he was the martyr who had sacrificed his youth to cater to a man who was never satisfied. The central problem wasn't just the money, it was the perception of fairness. The sisters were convinced Julian had manipulated their father in his final days to secure a larger share of the estate. They called him a thief, a liar, and a sociopath. They brought their vitriol to my stage, hoping I would validate their anger and force Julian to confess his sins. But as I sat there listening to their accusations, I realized that the truth they were looking for was far more complex and far more damaging than a simple case of embezzlement. Julian wasn't just hiding money, he was hiding a truth about their father that none of them were prepared to hear. When I first walked onto the stage that day, the air was thick with a level of hostility that you could feel in the back of your throat. Sarah and Megan were on one side, armed with legal documents and a lifetime of grievances. Julian sat on the other, looking like a man who had already checked out of the conversation. I looked at the audience, and then I looked at this broken family, and I knew that if we didn't get past the dollar signs, we were never going to get to the heart. I started the way I always do, by trying to establish the baseline. I wanted to know who these people were before the money became the only thing that defined them. We talked about their childhood, about the house they grew up in, and about the father who cast such a long shadow over all of them. It became clear very quickly that their father, Silas, hadn't just left behind a fortune. He had left behind a legacy of competition. He had pitted his children against each other since they were in grade school, using his affection as a prize to be won. This inheritance was just the final round of a game they had been playing for 40 years. As we dug into the backstory, I started to see the patterns that Julian had been forced to navigate. He described a father who was brilliant but emotionally cold, a man who believed that vulnerability was a weakness and that loyalty was something you bought rather than earned. Julian had been the one to take the brunt of that philosophy. While his sisters were away building their own families and careers, Julian was the one answering the 3 a.m. phone calls, the one taking the verbal abuse when a business deal went south, the one who sat by the bedside during the long, agonizing months of his father's terminal illness. The sisters saw his proximity to the money as an advantage. Julian saw it as a prison sentence. He spoke about the good son label with a bitterness that was palpable. He didn't feel like a favorite. He felt like a caretaker who had been overlooked until there was something to inherit. The resentment had been simmering for decades, and the inheritance was the pressure cooker that finally blew the lid off. I watched Sarah and Megan as Julian spoke. Their faces were masks of disbelief and scorn. They didn't want to hear about his sacrifice. They wanted to talk about the fact that the day after the funeral, Julian had moved $500,000 from their father's primary account into a private trust that they couldn't touch. To them, that was the smoking gun. That was the proof of his betrayal. They had spent months hiring private investigators and forensic accountants, convinced that Julian had systematically drained the estate before the will was even read. They were so focused on the transactional nature of the conflict that they were completely blind to the emotional reality of it. They weren't just grieving their father, they were grieving the relationship they never had with him, and they were using Julian as a scapegoat for that void. I've seen this movie before. When someone dies, the survivors often look for a place to put their pain, and money is a very convenient vessel for that. It's tangible. You can count it. You can fight over it in court. It's much easier to sue your brother for $500,000 than it is to admit that your father never told you he was proud of you. But Julian wasn't making it easy for them. He wasn't denying the transfer of funds. He was sitting there, stone-faced, refusing to explain why he did it. He had this wall up, a psychological fortress that he had built to survive his father, and now he was using it to shut out his sisters. I told him, Julian, you're standing in a burning house and you're complaining about the smoke, but you're the one holding the gasoline. If you want this to stop, you have to tell the truth, even if it's ugly. That's when the escalation really began. The sisters started shouting, throwing out accusations of elder abuse and fraud. They had brought photos of their father in his final weeks, looking frail and confused, suggesting that Julian had coerced him into signing documents he didn't understand. Julian finally snapped. He stood up, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and exhaustion, and he looked at his sisters with a level of contempt that silenced the room. He didn't talk about the money then. He talked about the reality of their father's final days. He talked about the things he had to do, the physical labor of caring for a dying man who had lost his dignity, the secrets he had to keep to protect the family name, and the inheritance that no one saw. A mountain of debt and a series of bad business decisions that their father had made in his cognitive decline. I leaned forward, sensing that we were finally touching the nerve. This wasn't just about a hidden trust, it was about a hidden reality. Julian revealed that the money he had moved wasn't an inheritance at all. It was the last of the liquid assets, and he had moved it to pay off a secret settlement their father had entered into years ago to avoid a scandal that would have wiped them all out. He hadn't been stealing from his sisters. He had been trying to save what was left of their father's reputation and their own financial future. But in doing so, he had become the villain in their story because he refused to let them see the man their father actually was. He was protecting a ghost at the expense of his living relationships. I looked at him and said, "You've been playing the hero in a play where everyone thinks you're the monster. How's that working for you?" He just stared at me. His eyes welled with tears he refused to let fall. And for the first time, I saw the little boy who was still just trying to earn his father's approval, even from the grave. The silence that followed Julian's revelation wasn't a peaceful one. It was the kind of silence that precedes a massive storm, the heavy, static-filled air that makes the hair on your arm stand up. Sarah and Megan didn't look relieved to find out their brother wasn't a common thief. They looked more offended than ever. And that told me everything I needed to know about the state of this family. When you present someone with a logical explanation for their pain and they reject it because they prefer the anger, you aren't dealing with a financial dispute. You're dealing with a psychological addiction to being the victim. Sarah was the first to break the silence. She leaned forward, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with a sharp, pointed disbelief. She looked at Julian like he was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. She started talking about convenient lies and last-minute fabrication. She didn't want to believe that her father, the man she had idolized from a distance, was anything less than the titan of industry she remembered. She accused Julian of creating a smear campaign against a dead man just to justify his own greed. This is what happens when people live in a fantasy world. They will kill the messenger to protect the illusion. I watched her, and I saw a woman who had built her entire identity on being the undervalued daughter of a great man. If the man wasn't great, if he was flawed and deceptive, then her struggle lost its meaning. I looked over at Megan. She was quieter, more calculated. She was the one who had been spearheading the legal assault. She didn't care about the emotional legacy as much as she cared about the ledger. She demanded to see the proof. She wanted names, dates, and account numbers. She was treating the stage like a courtroom, and she was trying to impeach her own brother. I've seen this time and again. When family members stop being siblings and start being opposing counsel, the family is already dead. They're just arguing over where to bury the body. Julian reached into his briefcase. He didn't do it with a sense of triumph. He did it with a profound sense of defeat. He pulled out a thick blue folder, the kind of folder that contains lives, not just papers. He didn't hand it to his sisters. He handed it to me. He said, "Dr. Phil, I never wanted them to see this. I promised him I would take this to my grave, but they've left me no choice. They're calling me a criminal in front of the whole world, and I can't protect a ghost if it means I lose my own life in the process." I opened the folder. As I scanned the documents, the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with a sickening thud. It wasn't just a business debt. It was a decades-long trail of hush money payments. Their father, the prestigious Silas, had been leading a double life. There was another woman, another family in another state, and a child, a son who was almost exactly Julian's age. The secret settlement wasn't just a one-time payment. It was a complex legal agreement designed to keep this other family quiet in exchange for a massive ongoing payout that had drained the estate's liquidity. The $500,000 Julian had moved wasn't a theft. It was the final buyout to ensure that this secret never hit the tabloids and that the remaining inheritance, the house, the business, the name stayed with Sarah, Megan, and Julian. I took a deep breath. I've seen some things in my time, but the sheer coldness of Silas's deception was staggering. He had left Julian to be the bagman for his sins. He had put the weight of his double life on the shoulders of his loyal son, knowing that Julian's sense of duty would prevent him from ever telling his sisters. It was the ultimate act of emotional manipulation from beyond the grave. Silas had ensured that Julian would be isolated, hated by his sisters, and burdened by a secret that would eat him alive, all to protect the image of a man who didn't deserve it. I looked at the sisters. They were watching me, waiting for me to debunk Julian's story. I didn't say a word at first. I just let the weight of the folder sit on my lap. Then I looked at Sarah. I said, "You spent the last 6 months calling your brother a monster. You've told anyone who would listen that he robbed you of your birthright. But what if I told you that while you were living your life, Julian was the only thing standing between you and a scandal that would have made your father's name a joke? What if I told you he wasn't stealing your money? He was spending his own peace of mind to keep your world from falling apart?" The color drained from Sarah's face. Megan reached for the folder, her hand shaking. I didn't give it to her right away. I wanted them to sit in that moment of uncertainty. I wanted them to realize that the truth they had been hunting for was a weapon that was about to blow up in their hands. I told them, before you look at this, you need to understand something. You can't unknow what's in this folder. Once you see it, the father you thought you had is gone forever. Is that really what you want? Or is the money just an excuse for the fact that you're still angry at a man who isn't here to answer your questions? This is the confrontation phase. But it wasn't the kind of shouting match people expect. It was a quiet, devastating realization. Megan grabbed the folder and started flipping through the pages. I watched her eyes move across the bank statements and the legal affidavits. I watched her face go from skepticism to confusion and finally to a cold, hard horror. She didn't cry. She just stared at a photo of the other son, a boy who looked more like Silas than any of them did. Sarah grabbed the papers from her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This can't be real," she whispered. "This is a forgery. Julian, you made this up. You're sick. You're actually sick." But she couldn't maintain the lie. The documents were notarized, the signatures were undeniable, and the truth was too heavy to push back. The escalation had reached its peak, and the crash was coming. I turned my attention to Julian. He was sitting with his head in his hands. He looked like a man who had finally dropped a heavy pack after a 100-mile hike. He wasn't looking at his sisters. He was looking at the floor. I said, "Julian, why did you do it? Why did you let them hate you for months? Why didn't you just tell them the day the will was read?" His voice was a ghost of its former self. "Because he asked me not to," he said. "On his deathbed, he took my hand and he begged me. He said, 'Julian, don't let your sisters know. Don't let them think I didn't love them. Protect the family.' I've spent my whole life protecting him. I didn't know how to stop." That is the definition of a toxic legacy. We think an inheritance is about what we get, but it's often more about what we're forced to carry. Silas hadn't left his children a gift, he had left them a curse. He had used Julian's loyalty as a shield and the sisters' ignorance as a weapon. I looked at the three of them, this fractured unit of three people who shared the same blood but no longer shared the same reality. I told them, "You're all fighting over the scraps of a life that was built on a lie. The money isn't the problem. The man who made it is the problem. And until you realize that Julian isn't your enemy, you're going to spend the rest of your lives being haunted by a man who didn't have the courage to be honest while he was alive." The tension on the stage was thick enough to choke on. The audience was silent. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was an autopsy. We were looking at the charred remains of a family dynamic that had been incinerated by the truth. Sarah began to sob, but it wasn't the performative sobbing of the wrong daughter we had seen earlier. It was the sound of a woman whose world had just been leveled. She looked at Julian, her eyes red and streaming. "I hate you," she choked out. "I hate you for telling me this. I'd rather you had stolen the money." And there it was. The ultimate confession. She preferred the lie of the evil brother to the truth of the flawed father. She wanted someone to blame, someone she could successfully sue, someone she could remain angry at without it ruining her memories. By telling the truth, Julian hadn't set them free. He had destroyed the only version of their father they were capable of loving. I leaned back in my chair and let that hang in the air. This is where the real work begins. This is where we stop talking about the law and start talking about the soul. I told Sarah, "You don't hate him because he told you. You hate him because he's the only one who didn't lie to you. You've been living in a house of cards, Sarah, and Julian has been holding up the walls until his arms gave out. You can keep blaming him, or you can start looking at the man who actually betrayed you. But you can't do both." The reaction Sarah had, that visceral preference for a lie over a painful truth, is something I've seen in the aftermath of 1,000 family tragedies. It's a defense mechanism. If Julian is the villain, then the world makes sense. If Julian is the villain, then their father is still the hero. And the only problem is a bad apple brother who can be sued, shunned, and excised like a tumor. But if the truth is what's in that folder, then the entire foundation of their lives is built on sand. Their father wasn't the man they thought he was. Their family legacy is a sham. And the brother they spent months crucifying is actually the only person who had their backs. That's a lot of psychological furniture to rearrange in one afternoon on a television stage. I looked over at Megan. She was the logical one, the one who lived by the numbers. She was still staring at the photo of the other son. I could see her mind working, trying to find a loophole, some way to make the numbers lie so she didn't have to face the reality. She looked at Julian and asked, in a voice that was finally devoid of its sharp, litigious edge, "How much is left, Julian? After the payoffs, after the legal fees, after the debt you said he hid, what is actually left of the estate?" Julian didn't even look up. "There's the house," he said quietly. "It's got a second mortgage on it that he took out 3 years ago to fund the initial settlement. There's the business, but the reputation is the only thing keeping the contracts alive. If this gets out, if the Silas legacy is exposed as a fraud, the clients will bolt. And the cash is gone, Megan. It's been gone for a long time. I've been using my own salary from the firm just to keep the lights on in the main office so you two wouldn't find out the truth before I could find a way to fix it." This was the moment of absolute clarity. The sisters hadn't been fighting over a fortune. They had been fighting over a carcass. They were like two people arguing over who gets to drive a car that doesn't have an engine. All the anger, the private investigators, the legal threats, it was all for nothing. I leaned in and addressed all three of them. "I want you to really hear what I'm about to say. You spent the better part of a year in a high-stakes war. You've said things to each other that you can never take back. You've treated your brother like a criminal. And all the while, he was working double shifts and draining his own bank account to make sure you didn't have to wake up and realize your father had left you with a mountain of debt and a scandalous secret. Julian didn't steal your inheritance. Your father spent it. He spent it on his secrets, and then he spent your brother's life asking him to cover it up." I turned to Julian. "You made a choice, Julian. You chose loyalty to a dead man over a relationship with your living sisters. You thought you were being noble. You thought you were protecting them. But let me ask you, how's that working for you? You're exhausted, you're broke, and your sisters hate your guts. Is that the protection your father wanted for you? Or did he just use you because he knew you were the only one who wouldn't say no?" Julian finally looked at me, and I saw the breaking point. His eyes were hollow. He was my father, Dr. Phil. He was all I had. I thought, if I could just get through this, if I could just settle the debts and keep the business afloat, eventually I could tell them. I thought I could fix it first. I didn't want them to feel the way I felt when I found out. I didn't want them to know that he had another son he loved more than us. That was the heart of it. That was the truth he'd been hiding, not just the money, but the emotional betrayal. Silas hadn't just had another family. According to the letters in that folder, he had been more present, more affectionate, and more generous with the secret son than he had ever been with Julian, Sarah, or Megan. Julian had discovered that his martyrdom was for a man who didn't even value him as much as the secret life he was hiding. I looked at Sarah and Megan. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, numbing shock. Sarah was looking at Julian differently now. Not with love, not yet, but with a burgeoning sense of guilt that was clearly overwhelming. She realized she had been kicking a man who was already carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. She had been calling him a thief while he was literally paying her bills with his own sweat. "You guys have a decision to make," I said, my voice dropping into that low, serious register that signals the end of the games. You can walk out of here and continue the legal battle. You can try to sue Julian for mismanagement or whatever your lawyers come up with, but you'll be suing a man who has nothing left to give you. Or you can acknowledge that the three of you have been victims of the same man. You've been played against each other by a master manipulator who didn't stop manipulating you just because his heart stopped beating. He left you a legacy of division, and so far, you're following his plan to the letter. The confrontation wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the power dynamic. Silas was still the one in control of that stage, even though he was in a casket 6 feet under. He was the one who had set this trap, and his children had walked right into it. I needed to break that cycle. I needed them to see that the only way to win this inheritance was to refuse to play the game Silas had designed. I told them about the concept of inherited shame. Silas had a lot of it, and he had dumped it all on Julian. Julian, in turn, tried to hide it from his sisters, which only created a different kind of shame, the shame of being accused of something you didn't do while you were actually doing something heroic. It was a hall of mirrors, and they were all lost in it. Julian, I said, look at your sisters. Really look at them. They aren't the enemies you think they are. They were just operating on the information they had. And Sarah, Megan, look at Julian. He isn't the puppet master you portrayed him as. He's a guy who's been drowning for a year and didn't want to pull you down with him. If you want to honor your father's memory, you're doing a great job of it right now by being just as secretive, just as angry, and just as divided as he was. But if you want to be a family, you have to burn that folder metaphorically and start over. Megan spoke up then. Her voice was small. What about the other brother, the one in the photos? Julian sighed. He doesn't want anything to do with us. He got his settlement. He's moved on. He has a life. He's the only one of us who isn't haunted by Silas, because Silas didn't try to own him the way he tried to own us. He just paid him to stay away. The irony was thick. The secret son was the only one who was actually free. The legitimate children were the ones in chains. I watched as Sarah slowly reached out her hand across the gap between the chairs. She didn't touch Julian, but the gesture was there. It was the first sign of a thaw. But a thaw is dangerous. It leads to a lot of mud before the ground gets solid again. I knew we were approaching the outcome phase of this journey. This wasn't going to be a hug-it-out moment where they all walked off into the sunset. There was too much damage for that. There were lawyers to fire, houses to sell, and a business to either liquidate or radically restructure. But more than that, there was a father to mourn. Not the great Silas they thought they knew, but the flawed, deceptive man he actually was. They had to grieve the loss of their illusions. I told them, we're going to take a break. I want the three of you to go into a room without your lawyers, without the cameras, and I want you to talk about one thing. Not the money, not the folder, but what you want your lives to look like 5 years from now. Do you want to be three strangers who share a dead father's secrets, or do you want to be siblings? Because you can't have it both ways. The money is gone. The secret is out. All you have left is each other. And frankly, after the way you've treated each other, you've got a lot of making up to do. As they stood up to leave the stage, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't the fiery, high-octane drama it had been an hour ago. It was somber. It was heavy. It was real. Julian looked like he could sleep for a month. Sarah looked like she'd been hit by a train. And Megan looked like she was finally starting to realize that some things can't be fixed with a spreadsheet. I watched them walk off, and I knew that the truth Julian had been hiding wasn't the end of the story, it was just the prologue. After the cameras stopped rolling for that segment, I followed them into the hallway. I don't usually do that. I like to give guests their space, but this was different. This wasn't a family that was just upset. This was a family that had just experienced a total structural collapse of their reality. I watched them walk toward the green room, three people who had shared a breakfast table for 18 years and a courtroom for one, and they looked like complete strangers. Julian was walking several paces ahead, his shoulders slumped as if the very air in the building was too heavy to move through. Sarah was trailing behind, still clutching those documents to her chest like they were a shield, and Megan was just staring at the floor, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. I realized then that the inheritance they were so worried about wasn't just the money they thought they were getting, it was the toxic behavior they had already inherited. They were acting exactly like Silas. They were isolated, they were defensive, and they were looking for a way to maintain control in a situation that was fundamentally uncontrollable. I walked into the room with them and closed the door. I didn't sit down. I wanted them to feel the gravity of the moment. I looked at Julian and I said, "You think you're done, don't you? You think that by dumping that folder on the table, you've paid your debt. But you haven't. All you've done is pass the hot potato to your sisters. You've lived with this truth for a year. You've had time to process it, to get angry, to get sad, and to eventually become numb to it. They've had 15 minutes. You can't expect them to move at your speed." Then I turned to the sisters, and you too, you've spent months building a case against your brother. You've spent thousands of dollars on lawyers and accountants, all because you were convinced he was the one who betrayed you. Now you find out the betrayal happened 40 years ago, and the person who did it isn't here to answer for it. So, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep punishing Julian because he's a convenient target, or are you going to wake up and realize he's the only ally you've got left? Sarah looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "How am I supposed to just be an ally with him, Dr. Phil? He lied to us. Every time we asked about the accounts, every time we asked why the distributions were delayed, he looked us in the eye and told us everything was fine. He let us believe he was the one in control. He let us hate him? No, I corrected her. You chose to hate him. It was easier than asking why your father's estate was so complicated. It was easier than admitting that maybe you didn't know your father as well as you thought. Julian didn't let you hate him. He sacrificed his relationship with you to protect a lie that wasn't even his to keep. Was it a mistake? Absolutely. It was a massive, catastrophic error in judgment. But he did it out of a misguided sense of loyalty to a man who clearly didn't deserve it. You're mad at Julian for the lie, but you're really mad at your father for the truth. Don't get the two confused. That's the thing about family secrets. They act like a slow-growing mold. By the time you see it on the walls, it's already in the foundation. Julian had been breathing in that mold for a year, and it had made him sick. He had developed this martyr complex where he felt like the more he suffered, the more he was saving his sisters. But you can't save people by lying to them. All you do is deprive them of the chance to deal with reality. I told Julian, "You've been playing God, son. You decided they couldn't handle the truth. So you manufactured a lie to keep their world intact. But look around. Their world isn't intact. It's in pieces. You didn't save them. You just delayed the inevitable. And the interest on that delay has cost you your family." Julian started to break down then. It wasn't a loud cry. It was that quiet, gut-wrenching sobbing of a man who has finally run out of excuses. "I just wanted him to be who I thought he was," he whispered. "If I told them, then he was just a liar. And if he was a liar, then all those years I spent working for him, all those nights I stayed late at the office while they were out living their lives, all of it was for nothing. I wasn't building a legacy. I was just cleaning up a mess." This is the psychological escalation that happens when the ego meets the truth. Julian had tied his own self-worth to his father's reputation. If the reputation was a fraud, then Julian's sacrifices were meaningless. That's a bitter pill to swallow. I told him, "Your work wasn't for nothing, Julian. You're a man of character. You showed up, you did the work, you kept your word. The fact that the man you did it for lacked that same character doesn't take away from yours. But you have to stop being the caretaker of the lie. You have to resign from that position today. If the business fails, it fails. If the house has to be sold, it gets sold. You cannot keep subsidizing a dead man's secrets with your own future." I watched as Megan, the cold, calculated sister, finally moved toward him. She didn't hug him, but she sat down in the chair next to him. She looked at the folder, the blue folder that had destroyed her world, and she said, "We have to call the lawyers, Julian. We have to stop the lawsuits." "There's no money to pay the lawyers anyway," Julian said with a weak, ironic laugh. "Then we tell them the truth," Megan said. "We tell the firm, we tell the creditors, and we deal with it together." It was the first time I'd heard the word together used in a positive context since they'd walked onto my stage, but I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Recovery never is. You don't just decide to be a family again and have everything go back to normal. There was still a massive amount of blame shifting that had to be addressed. Sarah was still looking at Julian with a lot of resentment. She felt like he had robbed her of the chance to say goodbye to the hero version of her father. She was grieving a man who never existed, and she was blaming the person who turned the lights on. I told Sarah, "You're mourning a ghost, Sarah, and you're trying to make Julian pay for the funeral. You need to decide right now, is your pride worth more than your brother? Because he's standing right here. He's flesh and blood. He's the one who stayed when everyone else left. He's flawed, he's secretive, and he made some terrible choices. But he's the only one left who remembers the smell of your mother's cooking or the way the house felt on Christmas morning. If you throw him away because you're mad at your father, you're going to be the loneliest person in the world." The confrontation wasn't just about the facts of the case, it was about the values they chose to live by. I've always said that you either manage your life or your life manages you. These three had been managed by a dead man's ghost for a year. They had been puppets in a play written by Silas, and the play was a tragedy. I was trying to get them to rip up the script. I told them we were going to bring in some professional help, not just lawyers, but family therapists who specialize in high conflict estates. I told them that Julian needed to step down as the executor and that they needed a neutral third party to liquidate what was left so that the money stopped being the focal point of their interactions. "You need to get the business out from between you," I said. "As long as you're arguing over assets and liabilities, you're never going to be able to look each other in the eye. You need to settle the accounts, pay the debts, and whatever is left, whether it's $10 or $10,000, you split it and you walk away from the Silas era of your lives. You have to decide that being a brother and being sisters is more important than being heirs." As we sat in that quiet room, the weight of the situation started to settle into a new shape. It wasn't the frantic, sharp-edged anger of the morning. It was a heavy, somber realization. They were poor, they were scandalous, they were broken, but for the first time in their adult lives, they were being honest. And honesty is the only foundation you can actually build something on. I told them, this is going to be the hardest year of your lives. You're going to have to face the public, you're going to have to face your friends, and you're going to have to explain why the great Silas's wasn't so great. But you're going to do it as a unit. Or you're going to fall apart individually. The choice is yours. Julian looked at Sarah and then at Megan. For the first time, he didn't look like a martyr. He just looked like a brother. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have told you. I was scared. I was just So scared that if you knew, you'd leave too. That was the breakthrough. It wasn't about the $500,000. It wasn't about the secret son. It was about the fear of abandonment that Silas had instilled in all of them. He had made them believe that their value was tied to his success, and without him, they were nothing. Julian had been holding on to the lie because he thought it was the only thing keeping his sisters in the room. He didn't realize that the lie was the very thing driving them away. I stood up and put my hand on Julian's shoulder. The truth doesn't just set you free, Julian. It clears the deck. Now you know who's really on your side. Now you know who's willing to stand in the foxhole with you when the bullets start flying. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've got two sisters who are pretty good at fighting. You might want to start pointing that fire in the same direction. The weeks following that day on my stage were some of the hardest that family had ever faced, and I made sure they didn't have to face them alone. We provided them with the resources they needed, not just a roadmap for the legal and financial mess Silas had left behind, but the psychological support to handle the fallout of a shattered identity. You see, when the patriarch of a family is exposed as a fraud, it doesn't just change the way you look at the past, it changes the way you look at yourself. Every memory Sarah and Megan had of their childhood was now colored by the knowledge of what was happening in the background. Every business trip Silas took, every late night at the office, every sacrifice he supposedly made for his real family was now revealed to be a component of a massive, lifelong deception. Julian was the one who bore the brunt of the immediate wreckage. He had to be the one to sign the papers that dissolved the Silas Group. He had to sit across from the board of directors and the creditors and explain that the liquid assets were gone. He had to watch the name his father had spent 40 years building get dragged through the mud of public record. But he told me later in a follow-up conversation that for the first time in his life, he felt like he could breathe. The secret was out. The burden of being the perfect son and the loyal protector had been lifted. He didn't have to lie anymore. He was broke, yes. The inheritance he had worked his whole life to manage had evaporated into a cloud of debt and settlement payments. But he was free. He told me, Dr. Phil, I used to wake up every morning with a pit in my stomach, wondering if today was the day the sisters would find out. Now they know. And the world hasn't ended. We're just starting a different kind of world. Sarah and Megan had to go through their own version of hell. They had to reconcile the man who tucked them in at night with the man who had a whole nother life, a whole nother son, and a mountain of secret debt. Sarah, in particular, struggled with a profound sense of retroactive betrayal. She felt like her entire childhood was a stage play where she was the only one who didn't know the script. We worked with her on understanding that her father's flaws didn't invalidate the love she felt or the moments of genuine connection they had. Silas was a compartmentalized man. He was capable of being a loving father to her while simultaneously being a deceptive husband and a failing businessman. Humans are complex, and sometimes they are. And also, rather than either or, he was a provider and a liar. He was a success and a failure, accepting that duality is the only way to stop the past from holding your future hostage. The sisters eventually dropped all legal action against Julian. They realized that the missing money wasn't in Julian's pocket, it was in the hands of the other family, or it had been swallowed up by the interest on loans Silas had taken out years ago. They had to sell the family estate, the big house on the hill that had been the symbol of their status. That was a pivotal moment. I remember Megan telling me that as they were packing up the boxes, she found a ledger Silas had kept separate from the business books. It wasn't filled with numbers, it was filled with notes he had written to himself about his children. He had written about how proud he was of Megan's sharp mind and how much he admired Sarah's spirit, but he had also written about his fear, his paralyzing fear that they would find out who he really was and stop loving him. He had spent a fortune and destroyed his legacy, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated pathological insecurity. He thought he had to be perfect to be loved. That was the outcome I was hoping for, not a sudden windfall of money, but a windfall of understanding. They didn't get the millions they thought were coming to them, but they got something much more valuable. They got the truth. They realized that the inheritance Silas truly left them wasn't the bank account, it was the opportunity to be better than he was. They had the chance to build a family dynamic based on transparency and mutual support rather than competition and secrets. Julian took a job at a small accounting firm, one where he wasn't the boss and wasn't responsible for anyone else's secrets. He's making less money, but he's sleeping 8 hours a night for the first time in a decade. Sarah and Megan have started a small business together, and while they still argue, they do it in the open. They don't hire lawyers to talk for them anymore. As for the other son, the one who lived in the shadows for so long, he never did join their family circle. And that's okay. Real life isn't a sitcom where everyone gathers around the table for Thanksgiving at the end of 30 minutes. He wanted his privacy and his own path, and Julian and his sisters respected that. They realized that they didn't need to fix everything their father had broken. Some things are just broken, and you have to learn to walk around the pieces. I've said it before and I'll say it again. You cannot change what you do not acknowledge. For years, this family was living a lie, acknowledging only the polished surface and ignoring the rot underneath. They were willing to destroy each other to protect a fantasy. But once they stood in the light of the truth, they found out that the truth wasn't nearly as scary as the lie they were living. They found out that they were stronger than their father's secrets. Looking back on Julian's case, it serves as a powerful reminder of what really matters when the dust settles. When you're lying on your deathbed, you aren't going to be thinking about your stock portfolio or the size of your estate. You're going to be thinking about the people you loved and whether or not they truly knew you. Silas died a wealthy man on paper, but he died a pauper in spirit because he was too afraid to be known. Julian, Sarah, and Megan decided they weren't going to live like that. They decided that their legacy wouldn't be about the money they left behind, but the honesty they lived with every day. They still have bad days. They still have moments where the anger at their father flares up, especially when they see his name on an old building or hear someone speak about his legendary business sense. But now they look at each other and they know the real story. They have a shared reality, and that is the strongest bond there is. They are no longer three individuals fighting over a ghost gold. They are a family that survived a storm. And in my book, that makes them wealthier than their father ever was. People ask me all the time why I do what I do, why I get into the middle of these messy, ugly family disputes. It's because I believe that the truth is the only thing that can actually heal a human heart. It's messy, it's painful, and it's often devastating in the short term. But in the long term, it's the only thing that lasts. This family came to me looking for a check, but they walked away with a future. They stopped being the victims of Silas's past and started being the architects of their own lives. They cleared the deck, they stood their ground, and they chose each other. And at the end of the day, that's what a real inheritance looks like. It's not about what's in the will, it's about what's in the heart. The stage is often a place for drama, but for this family, it was a place for surgery. We cut out the cancer of the secrets, and while the recovery was slow and left some scars, the patient lived. They lived to see another day, to tell another story, and to build something that wouldn't crumble when the wind blew. That is the power of the truth. That is why we do what we do. And as I told them on the last day we spoke, you don't need your father's permission to be happy. You've already got everything you need right in front of you. They finally believed it. and that's the truth.